You spend your whole life chasing security, saving, working, planning for the day you can finally exhale. But what if I told you most people never get there? They don't fail because they didn't earn enough. They fail because they trusted a system that was never built for them to win. Charlie Munger once said the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. But that's exactly what most people do every time fear takes control, every time the market dips, every time life whispers, maybe you're already too late. At 45, you're told to double down, work harder, save faster, risk less. But Munger learned something different: the truth that nobody tells you about retirement. It's not about how much money you make. It's about how little you lose and how well you protect your peace while the world keeps burning around you. Because the truth is, most retirements don't fail from bad math. They fail from bad psychology. And once you understand how Munger avoided both, you'll see that saving your retirement isn't about chasing more. It's about finally learning enough. I remember a man named Robert, 52 years old. He'd worked in the same company for nearly 3 decades, loyal, disciplined, never extravagant. Every month, he watched a small portion of his paycheck disappear into a retirement fund. And for most of his life, that single number on a screen was his definition of safety. But one evening, sitting at his kitchen table, Robert opened his laptop and saw something that made his chest tighten. Inflation had eaten through his savings faster than he ever imagined. His pension smaller than promised. And suddenly, that old word, retirement, didn't sound peaceful anymore. It sounded expensive. He wasn't reckless. He didn't overspend, didn't chase risky investments. He did everything right. And yet, as he stared at his future spreadsheets, it didn't feel like enough. That's the quiet crisis no one talks about. It doesn't happen in your 20s. It happens when you've done everything the system told you to do and still end up uncertain. His wife, Margaret, tried to reassure him. She said, "We'll be fine. We've got our home, some savings, no big debts." But Robert couldn't silence the thought that haunted him. What if the market drops right before I retire? What if healthcare drains it all? What if we outlive our money? That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of the numbers, but because of what they meant. For the first time, he realized retirement wasn't a finish line, it was a bet. A bet on time. A bet on control. A bet on how long your body, your mind, and your savings will last. And in that silence, he remembered something he'd once heard from Charlie Munger. The best way to get what you want is to deserve what you want. Robert didn't feel he deserved failure, but he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd misunderstood what wealth really meant. That's where his shift began. Not with a new investment strategy. Not with another spreadsheet. But with a question: what does enough really look like? A week after that restless night, Robert sat in his living room watching an old interview with Charlie Munger. The interviewer had asked Munger something simple. How much money does a person need to feel free? Munger smiled, that small, knowing smile of a man who had already seen the game from every angle. He said, "It's not about how much you have. It's about how much you can live without." The line cut through Robert like a blade. Not because it was new but because it was true in a way he had never allowed himself to believe. For 30 years, he'd been chasing more income, more savings, more security, thinking that the feeling of safety was somewhere just beyond the next zero. But Munger's words made him realize something brutal. The system had trained him to measure peace in dollars, not in freedom. He paused the video and leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he wondered what if his problem wasn't financial at all? What if it was mathematical only on the surface, but psychological underneath? He began revisiting his numbers, not to add, but to subtract. He listed the things that truly mattered. The house where his children grew up. The small garden where he spent his mornings. The morning coffee shared with Margaret. And then, in another column, he wrote the things that didn't. The oversized car he barely drove. The subscription fees he forgot to cancel. The clothes still hanging with their price tags. He saw something he'd never seen before. The illusion of more had quietly replaced the security of enough. That night, he went back to the Munger video. Another line echoed through the speakers. The first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. The second is to know when enough is enough. Robert realized his retirement fear wasn't because he didn't have enough money. It was because he didn't know how to stop wanting more. He'd been playing a game with no finish line. A race against people he'd never meet, trying to prove a number could define a life. He closed the laptop and stared at the dark window. His reflection looked older than he remembered. But beneath the wrinkles, he noticed something new. A kind of quiet rebellion. Maybe the answer wasn't to chase a bigger fund. Maybe it was to build a smaller life intentionally, calmly, rationally. Because Charlie Munger wasn't just talking about wealth. He was talking about escape. Escape from the noise, the fear, the endless comparisons that keep people working long after they no longer need to. For Robert, that realization wasn't comforting at first. It was terrifying. Because it meant he'd spent 3 decades chasing the wrong kind of freedom. But it was also the beginning of something sacred. A shift from fear to clarity. He poured himself a cup of tea, looked at Margaret, and said quietly, "Maybe we don't need to save more. Maybe we just need to spend less time being afraid." And in that single sentence, his life began to simplify. Not through spreadsheets, but through perspective. The next morning, Robert woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, just that soft amber glow spilling through the blinds, painting the room in quiet shades of gold. Margaret was still asleep. For a while, he just sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet, his mind strangely calm. The night before, something had clicked, not like a sudden epiphany, but like the sound of gears finally aligning after years of grinding in the wrong direction. He made coffee and opened a blank notebook, not for numbers this time, but for ideas. At the top of the page, he wrote one question. What would life look like if we stopped trying to be rich and started trying to be free? He started listing the things they could live without, not out of sacrifice, but out of choice. The big car payment that no longer brought pride. The second property that sat empty most of the year. The endless subscriptions, the luxury dinners, the things meant to show success to people who weren't even watching. Each line he crossed off felt lighter, like removing bricks from a wall that had quietly trapped him for years. By the time Margaret woke up, he was still sitting at the table, surrounded by notes. She smiled softly and said, "You look different. Did something happen?" He laughed, not the kind of laugh that hides exhaustion, but one that releases it. "Yeah," he said, "I think I finally figured out what Charlie Munger meant by knowing when enough is enough." Over the next few months, Robert began to re-engineer his life like a man auditing his own happiness. He sold the second car. He cancelled half the recurring bills that served no purpose. He rented out the second home to generate income instead of pride. And slowly, the noise of financial anxiety began to fade. But freedom, he discovered, wasn't immediate joy, it was a process of detachment. At first, it was uncomfortable. He missed the status symbols, the sense of achievement that came from being busy. There were days he'd open his laptop just to check the markets, even though he didn't need to anymore. The habit of chasing numbers was like an addiction, invisible but powerful. Margaret noticed it too. "You don't have to keep looking," she told him one evening. "The numbers aren't the point anymore." And she was right. The goal had quietly shifted from growth to peace. Robert started taking walks in the evenings instead of refreshing stock tickers. He cooked dinner himself, something he hadn't done in years. And for the first time in decades, he felt time, real, unowned, unbought time, stretch in front of him. He began to understand what Munger meant when he said, "The best thing a human being can do is to help another human being know more." He realized that this wisdom wasn't just about money, it was about control. Financial freedom wasn't about accumulation. It was about discipline. The discipline to say, "This is enough." The courage to stop running a race you've already won. The irony was beautiful. The moment he stopped trying to feel secure, he finally did. He looked at Margaret one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch and said, "All my life, I thought freedom meant never worrying about money again. But now I think freedom means never letting money worry me." She smiled. "That sounds like something Munger would have said." He nodded. "Maybe it's something I should have understood 30 years ago." The camera fades to the evening light, calm, warm, distant. The house is smaller now. The car is older. But the silence, that long, unbothered silence, feels luxurious. It had been a year since Robert made the change. The spreadsheets were gone. The investment charts, the ones that once decided his moods, now sat quietly in an old folder, untouched. In their place, he kept a notebook, the same one that began with a single question. What would life look like if we stopped trying to be rich and started trying to be free? He flipped through it one morning while sitting by the window. The air was still, the kind of morning that feels suspended in time. He looked outside, children walking to school, an old couple holding hands, a street vendor arranging fruit. Simple lives. Ordinary moments. And that's when he realized something that made him pause. He had spent decades chasing extraordinary wealth, but the peace he'd been searching for was hidden in ordinary moments all along. He remembered something Charlie Munger once said. The big money is not in the buying and selling, but in the waiting. But now, Robert understood that Munger wasn't just talking about stocks. He was talking about life. The big rewards, the ones that truly matter, come not from frantic action, but from patience. Patience with time. Patience with yourself. Patience with life's unfolding. Robert began to notice how quiet his mind had become. He used to think stillness was laziness, now he saw it as wisdom. The same discipline that made him save, invest, and compound was now being used to be still. To not chase. To not compare. To simply exist without needing to prove. He wrote a new line in his notebook that morning. I don't need more, I need less, but better. That became his new investing philosophy, not for money, but for life. Fewer possessions. Fewer worries. Fewer people trying to sell him fear. Because the truth he now saw was uncomfortable and liberating. The retirement industry wasn't built to set people free. It was built to keep them afraid. Afraid of not having enough. Afraid of losing status. Afraid of slowing down. He thought back to all those seminars he attended in his 40s. The advisors showing graphs of retirement shortfalls. The commercials with silver-haired couples walking on beaches. The constant reminder that he needed just a little more. And he realized that was the trap. Not the numbers, not the math, the fear. Fear was the product. Freedom was never part of the business model. Charlie Munger had tried to tell people this all along. He wasn't rich because he sought luxury, he was rich because he sought clarity. Munger's wealth was a byproduct of how he thought, not what he wanted. Robert now saw money for what it really was. A tool. A servant. A silent partner, but never a master. He smiled as he sipped his coffee. It wasn't expensive coffee anymore, no imported blends, no fancy machine. Just simple, black, hot coffee. And somehow, it tasted better than anything money could have bought. That morning, he called his son. They hadn't talked deeply in a while, their conversations had always been quick, polite, transactional. But today, he just wanted to talk. No agenda. No updates. Just presence. His son asked, "Dad, are you really done working?" Robert chuckled. "I think I'm finally starting to work," he said. "Just, on different things." "What kind of things?" "Peace," he replied softly. "And understanding." There was silence for a while, not awkward, but meaningful. The kind of silence you only get when two people finally meet in truth, not expectation. After the call, Robert sat back and closed his eyes. The sound of the clock filled the room, steady, rhythmic, indifferent. He used to hate that sound. Now, he loved it. Because each tick wasn't a reminder of time passing, it was proof of time given. He finally understood Munger's hidden lesson. Wealth doesn't protect you from time. It only protects you from noise. But peace protects you from yourself. He smiled again, that quiet, content smile that only people who have truly stopped running can make. He whispered softly to himself. I spent my youth chasing numbers. Now I'm counting moments. The light through the window grew softer, warmer, like the closing of a long chapter. And for the first time in decades, Robert didn't think about tomorrow. He simply lived the day he had. The house was quiet now. No phone calls. No alarms. just the sound of wind brushing gently against the window. Robert sat in his chair, the same chair he'd bought decades ago when he first got promoted. Back then, it had been a symbol of success. Now, it was just a comfortable place to sit and breathe. On the table beside him lay two things. A faded photograph of his younger self holding his first paycheck, grinning wide. And a small note card, where he'd written the last piece of wisdom he'd learned from Charlie Munger. It said, "The goal isn't to have everything you want. It's to be okay when you finally have enough." He looked at that note for a long time. The words seemed to hum quietly in the stillness of the room. Enough. Such a small word. And yet, it took him half a lifetime to understand it. Outside, the sun was setting. The light hit the edge of the photograph, casting a soft golden glow over his younger face. That eager, ambitious man who once believed money could protect him from uncertainty. Robert smiled at that version of himself. Not with regret, but with compassion. He understood now that young man wasn't greedy. He was just scared. Scared of running out. Scared of slowing down. Scared of being forgotten. But Munger was right. Fear is what destroys wealth long before money ever disappears. Because fear makes you chase things you already have, just in case they vanish. As the last light of the evening faded, Robert stood up and walked to the window. He watched the world outside not through the lens of loss or achievement, but simply through gratitude. He whispered softly, almost to himself. "I don't need to win anymore. I just need to be." The city lights began to flicker on one by one as if signaling the quiet acceptance of another day passing. And somewhere in that stillness, Robert felt it, the peace he'd been chasing all along. Not in numbers. Not in plans. But in enough. He turned off the lamp, leaving only the warm glow of dusk to fill the room. And for the first time in many years, he didn't check his balance before bed. He just let the night arrive softly, naturally, without resistance. Because wealth, he finally realized, isn't about never working again. It's about no longer working against yourself. The screen fades to black. A faint piano note echoes. Then silence. The richest people are not those who earn the most, but those who stop needing more.